Good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here with you tonight. As was said, my name is Sami Awad, and I am a Palestinian. I live in Bethlehem. And I just want to share a little bit of my history, my personal story, because a lot of what I do now and the work I'm engaging in has to do with the family background. One of the things I always say is that when Palestinians and Israelis share their story, we actually start with a common opening line. Not all the time, but most of the time we have the same opening line. And that opening line is in 1948. And we all know what happened in 1948, but then, of course, the narratives shift completely after that opening line. More recently, I began to start from a different opening line. And the reason I did this was because if you start from a line that is about war and conflict, that means you set the precedent for what this land is about, what the narrative is about. That this is a land that has historically, continuously been one that was ridden all the time with conflict and war by different groups. And 1948 was just another one of those wars that led to the building of a nation and the state for Israel and what we call the Palestinians, the Nakba, the catastrophe for us. And it just feeds into the narrative that many people try to convince us in, which, as I said, is a historic, intractable, long war that has been going on. Some people even would refer it back to biblical times. Since the times of Abraham's kids, these two offsprings have been just at each other whenever they can to kill each other. The narrative that I start with is before 1948. And I specifically talk about the neighborhood that my father was born in and grew up in, a neighborhood that many of you may know called Musrara in Jerusalem, which was a neighborhood that was actually mixed and evenly divided between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, who not just got along with each other, actually were very, very close with each other. My father as a child and my grandmother tell stories of how we come from a Christian background, how the Christian children and the Muslim children used to go to the Jewish homes during Shabbat. And they're the ones that turn on and off the lights and turn on and off the ovens. That was what they did. They didn't even know why they did this, but that's what their mother told them to do every Shabbat. And so for me, the question that I live continuously is what happened? What happened that, and I'm not in any way claiming it was perfect or utopian. I fully am aware of the history of the conflicts that did exist between these groups. But even those conflicts, I would say, were conflicts that were led by foreign intervention. If not physical intervention, foreign experiences or narratives that were also evolving around that same time. And so for me, it's been a challenge coming from a background that has this narrative as embedded in our family specifically, to look into the current reality and ask what happened that shifted that reality and what can we do to bring that understanding back again. How much? A minute left. I want to, just the last minute I want to say to prepare, to set the stage. I grew up also in a narrative in my older generation that believed that, or was told that there is only one possibility for peace. And anybody that rejected that possibility simply rejected peace, which was the Oslo peace process that began in 93 and 94. And for me, it has been also a personal journey to begin to also understand and look into that peace process and to challenge it and to look into the failures in it and to look into what is the learning that we could have from that peace process to really begin to establish a real understanding of peace and justice and equality in the Holy Land. And this is where the name of the organization that I run comes from. It's called Holy Land because for me, despite whatever political connotations and names we give the land, at the end of the day, it is holy sacred land for three beautiful, amazing religions that really need to find out how to live in it in peace together.
Thank you.
As was said, my name is Yehuda. I grew up not far from here, actually. I grew up north, maybe 3-4 miles north of here. And I didn't grow up as part of the Jewish community. I grew up in New York City, for the most part, pre-Giuliani New York City, very multicultural experience, and I learned a lot growing up here. One of the things I learned, probably by the time I was 14, is that if somebody offers you peace in exchange for your wallet or your shoes or your watch, the answer is no. Not because any of those things are more valuable than your life, but because honor is. And because nobody, at least in my circles growing up, wants to be the type of person who would give up his money or his watch or his jacket without a fight. And if any such person was around, like no one wanted to hang out with him. Like that was somebody who was kind of socially excluded from the world that I lived in. And I didn't grow up very politically active, but I grew up very ethnically Jewish. Like I was Jewish, I wasn't part of the Jewish community, and I wasn't ritually observant. I was Jewish the way some of my friends were Puerto Rican or Albanian or Irish or whatever. And around, when I went to college, and my second year in college, I discovered the internet for the first time. Sounds crazy probably to a lot of people, but it's what happened. And which meant I had access to information I never really had before. You imagine just discovering the internet for the first time as a 19 or 20-year-old, and just like typing something up and being like, wow, I had, all my life I thought I'd have to go to like a library and dig through books to find this stuff, and it's all accessible to me quickly, like faster than I could read it and absorb it. So I had access to information I didn't have before. I started knowing a little bit about what was going on in the world, and I came to the understanding that, and this is the way it was contextualized, I'm saying it the way I understood it at the time, that Israel as a state, Israel as a nation, was expected to give up part of its territory, not only part of its territory, but really the cradle of Jewish civilization, the West Bank, Samaria and Judea, in exchange for peace. And the very idea that Israel as a nation was expected to give up part of its territory for peace humiliated me, actually embarrassed me, and made me feel like my people on a collective level, because I always knew Israel was my people even if I was living here, my people was behaving on a national level like that kid who we wouldn't allow to socialize with us if he had given up his watch or his shoes for peace with some other kids in the neighborhood. And Israel was behaving like a nation without honor. And I found this humiliating, and I became politically active, instantly, against this idea of a two-state solution. And then the Intifada started, the second Intifada, and I felt, coming from outside the Jewish community, that the most normal, natural thing I could do is drop out of school and go join the Israeli army, because my people were at war, and I felt irresponsible being a Jew in New York, studying in university, while Jews my age in Israel were expected to put on uniforms and go to war. So I dropped out of school and I moved to Israel. And my understanding of the conflict was very simple. It was the media depiction of the conflict, a war between Jews and Arabs, and I'm a Jew, so my job is to go and fight Arabs. And when I got to Israel, they don't just hand you a gun when you get off the plane. You have to wait until drafting into the army. So in the meantime, I decided to go study in a yeshiva called Machon Meir, where I teach now. And I also started some political movements, including going to different hilltops in the West Bank to create new Jewish communities. And then after the army, I was already married, and we moved to a neighborhood in East Jerusalem called Ras Al Amud to create a Jewish community there. We were there for 4 years in the beginning. It's called Ma'ale Zeitim. But it was living there in East Jerusalem that I first came to recognize that the Palestinians are also victims of the conflict. And it's not as simple as I had thought it was up to that point, and that they have a story too. And it's a real story. It's not just like propaganda meant to undermine my people's story. It's actually a real story, and there's real pain, and there's real injustice. And of course, my first instinct was to blame that on Fatah, on the Palestinian Authority, and I think there's legitimacy to placing that blame. But I also came to understand that a lot of Israel's policies are responsible for what was taking place. And by the time I left Ma'ale Zeitim after 4 years and moved to Beit El, I was already involved in really trying to bring some of the more radical Jews and radical Palestinians living in the territories together to understand each other's stories and to be able to engage in a shared struggle against some of the things that I believe are collectively oppressing us.
Thank you. Thank you both for the great introduction. Now we'll go through questions, and you'll have 3 minutes to answer each question, with the other having 1 minute to comment. So I'll start with Sam now. First question. What do you mean by the term occupation to describe the situation for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza? What are the implications?
Well, growing up, I grew up in a situation where we as Palestinians define the presence and the rule of the Israeli military over our lives as occupation. So we grew up in a system where the military controlled every aspect of our life. It was military orders and procedures and regulations that regulated everything for us. And basic freedoms, and this is what I call direct military occupation. So this is from 1967 till 1993, before the peace process began, where the basic civil freedoms that are so much celebrated here in the US and we aspire for, and even celebrated in Israel, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom to organize, freedom to voice your opinion, freedom of the press, to elect your leaders, to determine where your tax money goes. These freedoms simply did not exist for us, in addition to the physical presence of the Israeli military. And so until that point, occupation was just the fact that our lives were completely under the Israeli military control, completely occupied. There was a shift that happened in 1993 with the beginning of the peace process, where I would say the occupation kind of redesigned itself, where as Palestinians were given a sense of self-autonomy in especially the major areas where they lived, the major metropolitan cities, with the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, that occupation shifted to become a movement where ending it meant achieving political liberation, achieving what Oslo was promising us, the two-state solution. So what was the hindrance to achieving this was the Israeli military and the Israeli political rule and the settlements that existed in the West Bank and Jerusalem, and until a few years back in the Gaza Strip itself. And so for me, I grew up in a narrative that defined occupation as the system of oppression that prevented us from establishing our political independent nation state, as we were promised by the international community, as we were promised by UN resolutions, as we were promised by our leaders and many Israeli leaders as well. Even until today, left or right, many Israeli leaders still talk about the two-state solution. More recently, I've had maybe a shift or kind of a back return to an understanding of occupation that's different than that. Where for me, I define occupation today not as the system that is preventing me from establishing a political nation-state entity, but as the system that is not allowing me to live my civil equal rights in the land, the same as Yehuda or the same as any other Israeli in the land. So I call it from going from a big O occupation to a small O occupation, where that means the movement that addresses this shifts from being a liberation movement to a civil rights movement, shifts from being, as a nonviolent practitioner, shifts from being a movement like what Gandhi practiced, which was liberating India from the colonialist British regime, to a similar movement to what's happened like in the United States in the civil rights movement, or South Africa in the one person, one vote movement. That how can we achieve civil equal rights in a country that we all belong to? So this is how the shift for me in defining occupation.
Rabbi Yehuda, what exactly does alternative peace activism mean? And how does alternative peace activism differ from regular peace activism?
Okay, so for people who've spent significant time in Israel or have been involved politically in Israel, peace activism is usually exclusively associated with a very specific solution, the two-state solution. And a peace activist is usually somebody who works with or volunteers with an organization that's promoting the two-state solution. And so we're alternative in three ways, really. Number one, in that we circumvent the international community and what's called the peace industry, those NGOs who are just existing to promote a two-state solution, and we reject the two-state solution. So that's the first way in which we're alternative, that we reject the two-state solution, circumvent the international community, and circumvent the peace industry. The second reason we're considered alternative is that instead of bringing the quote-unquote moderates together, like the westernized diplomats from Tel Aviv and from Ramallah, to come and sign an American piece of paper that really represents no one, we bring the quote-unquote extremists together, those who are really living the aspirations of their people, those who are willing to fight and to kill and to die for things that they believe to be important to them. And I think it's very important to put those actors into the role of peacemaker, because we, not even like, we are the ones who would torpedo any solution that's imposed on us by the outside and that doesn't represent us and our aspirations. And the third reason why we're alternative is that we don't believe peace can be achieved by forcing two sides to compromise on things that are deeply important to them. Because the truth is that if there was some kind of peace agreement, some kind of solution that prevented me and Jews like me from having what we believe to be rightfully ours, and I'm sure there are many Palestinians also who, if they felt there was a solution that prevented them from having everything that is rightfully theirs, the fight would not be over. I would keep fighting. And I'm sure there are many other people, Jews and Palestinians, who would keep fighting. Therefore, the only way to create a real solution that could work for us is one that allows both peoples to fully win in our respective narratives. And in order for that to work, we have to unpack what that means. We have to recognize that Jews and Palestinians for the last 100 years have been living in two completely different movies, and we've been fighting past each other. We've been fighting our fantasies of the other instead of really fighting the other. We need to figure out the aspirations and the grievances of both peoples in order to create a solution that addresses those grievances and addresses those aspirations and allows both peoples to feel like winners in the same land with the same solution. So it's really a lot like narrative therapy in that regard. And when I say narrative, I'm defining a narrative as a series of facts that are selectively chosen and contextualized within a very specific ideology. So I'm arguing that there are millions of facts when it comes to the last 100 years of our conflict, and each side is really just choosing the facts that support our political argument and our political agenda, and ignoring other facts that are true in order to present kind of a narrow, generic story. And I think the real truth is a bigger truth that includes both ostensibly rival truths, and my job as a peace activist is really to create that bigger story where we can both be protagonists together instead of being the antagonists in the story of the other.
Thank you. Sami, what is the current reality of the political, economic, and military situation for Palestinians in the West Bank?
Well, the current reality is one, I don't know how many have been there or have traveled there. We currently have a system that rules the Palestinians, which is called the Palestinian Authority. It was a temporary measure that was established as part of the Oslo peace process. And I say temporary because the mandate of the Palestinian Authority was supposed to end by 1999 with reaching a political agreement, which is the two-state solution. So in a sense, the mandate of that Palestinian Authority has ended many, many years ago. The challenge that we have now is because we were not able to reach that political agreement, we were not able to reach the two-state solution the way Oslo promised us and the way the international community promised us. That system that was created has maintained itself and its operation over the Palestinians. So we live in a situation where, yes, we have 160-some nations and countries that have recognized Palestine, have recognized the name, but the reality that we live in is that the Palestinians simply do not have anything to really present themselves as a state other than the fact that we have self-autonomy. We have a Palestinian leadership that has many, many challenges just to its own existence. There are many corruption challenges. There is a full dependency on international and foreign aid for its survival. I jokingly call, even though it's a government, I call it probably the biggest non-governmental organization in the world. Because like any NGO, I mean, I run an NGO, and like you're saying, if you want to talk about, you know, like the peace industry, in a sense, this is what the Palestinian Authority is. They are an institution that depends on foreign aid, and this foreign aid is restricted. Like any organization, if you follow the agenda of the founders, you get the money. If you don't follow, you don't get the money. And so this is the reality that we live in. The control of the Palestinian Authority, as I said before, is in the high populated cities of the Palestinians. So cities like Bethlehem, Ramallah, Nablus, Tul Karam. So this is even that sense of self-autonomy. So many people hear the West Bank, and the assumption is that the Palestinians have control over the West Bank. In reality, it's 15% of the West Bank that the Palestinians have authority or control in, which is areas A. And these areas are limited, the land is limited in these areas, access to the resources is limited, the restrictions on movement is very limited as well, with checkpoints and roadblocks that exist there. And so it's a very, very challenging situation that we live in. And then for me, I would say it's a situation that simply cannot continue the way it is. There needs to be a real solution to this, because part of it, and I think this is one of the big challenges, is that the leadership of the Palestinian Authority has also benefited from having power in these areas, benefited from the financial and political rewards that they get from maintaining power. And these rewards are given by Israel and by the international community. And so if you maintain your political party, you maintain control, you maintain a sense of security over the Palestinians, where 30% of our actual income is spent on security measures and security personnel. It's one of the highest in the world for a non-nation or a non-state entity. We maintain you. And so for me, there is a lot of also political corruption that is involved in this that needs to be addressed. I would say for the average Palestinian, the reality of life is that life is very difficult, very challenging. There's a lot of sense of resignation and hopelessness that exists. Palestinians actually believe that nothing works to achieve anything for their future. So when you say Palestinians believe in violence, believe me, most Palestinians don't believe in violence or believe in armed resistance. Most Palestinians don't believe in non-violence. Most Palestinians don't believe in negotiations. Most Palestinians are now just focused on how do I maintain my life and live my life in this reality, hoping for some miraculous reason something will change. And I think what we're trying to say is that instead of waiting for the West to come up with another crazy option for us to live in, what is the option that we're going to create together, the people in the land and living on the ground?
Rabbi Yehuda, how would you say Jews living in the territories are experiencing the status quo? Would you say they identify more as aggressors or victims in this conflict?
I would say the Jews living in the West Bank almost completely identify as victims in the conflict, but not necessarily victims of Palestinians. I think that we're not monolithic. A Jew living in Hebron is very different from a Jew living in Ariel, and a Jew living in Ma'ale Adumim is very different from a Jew living in Beit El. We have diversity. And then there's Gush Etzion, which is completely something else. But I think the common denominator, the common ideological, political denominator that almost every Jew in the West Bank shares is this idea that we are an ancient people from this land, specifically from the West Bank. We were unjustly displaced against our will by the Romans, and then we somehow, against all odds, managed to successfully return to our land thousands of years later, yet the entire international community seems determined to displace us again. And we insist on resisting that displacement. And the only method of resistance we've come to figure out so far is to try and populate as much of the West Bank as possible in order to make removing us difficult. That's the most effective means of resistance we figured out so far. And that's the experience we're having. I think Palestinians are actually very peripheral to that story. Yet there is also this ethnic conflict that has existed for 100 years that we're engaged in while we're trying to prevent the international community from displacing us from our land. So I think that's the experience most of us are having. Even in recent weeks, we've seen a lot of drama just with the destruction of Amunah, and that's hundreds of people, large families that were living somewhere and were displaced, and are, to the best of my knowledge, still living together in some gymnasium in Ofra. And the difference maybe that we see between our struggle, which is not only our struggle, but the struggle of our ancestors. We believe we're fighting the same fight that our ancestors fought thousands of years ago against the Babylonians and against the Greeks and against the Romans. And the difference between, I think, our struggle and the Palestinian struggle is that the Palestinian struggle is allowed to be a real struggle. And we're at the point where people don't even recognize we have a legitimate cause. People don't even recognize that we have a legitimate struggle. And when we talk about families that are displaced from Amunah or from Migron or from Gush Katif in 2005, the attitude of most people around the world is, well, there's something wrong with you. We can slap the word settler on you, and then it's legitimate to uproot you and displace you. And your pain doesn't matter, and your cause doesn't matter. So I think right now we're at the point where we're looking to even we're trying to be able to have a struggle that's considered legitimate in the world, despite the fact that that it's actually thousands of years old.
Thank you. Sami, what are the roles and responsibilities of the Palestinian Authority in Palestinian life?
Yeah. I mean, as I said before, I'll just add to that. The sad reality that we live in now is that the Palestinian Authority has not done anything to really promote within the Palestinian community a sense of democracy, civil society, and diversity. And I think, again, that's part of it is due to certain people that want to control and maintain power over the area, but also being supported by the international community and by Israel itself. For example, we had elections in 2006, and these elections, if we like it or not, led to a group like Hamas win the elections. I actually think Fatah lost the elections more than Hamas won the elections, but at the end of the day, the numbers showed that Hamas won. And there was a big sort of reaction to that by the Israeli government, by the international community, and by the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority that led to a civil war between the two. And for the first time, Palestinians were killing each other in Gaza and Ramallah because of these two political factions fighting over power. And the reality that we live in now is that, yes, the Palestinian political system is divided between Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and each party has and continues to maintain power in these areas. We haven't had elections since that time. We were supposed to have municipal elections just a few months ago. That did not happen because of the fear as to who might win and who might lose the elections, so they'd rather cancel elections than to risk engaging in a system of democracy. And the reality is that there is a growing mistrust and gap between the Palestinian population and the leadership itself. You hear this more and more often, where people are more critical of the Palestinian Authority, more critical of the leadership, more disconnected with them. And many people are beginning to ask the questions of, in a sense, what we're trying to ask is what comes next. Different polls that have come out recently have also shown that most Palestinians, especially younger Palestinians, are even giving up on the idea of the two-state solution as something that they want to live in for the future. And more are supporting a one-state solution, whatever that looks like. But they're saying that as Palestinians, we've tried this experiment with our leadership, and sadly I would say that many people sacrificed their lives to bring that leadership into the land, to bring the PLO back into the land because we had high expectations of them. But the reality that we experienced after that was one where, sadly, it resembles more of a totalitarian police state that was created to maintain control over the Palestinians than even to live a little bit of that, even if it was an illusion, that two-state understanding of, yes, as Palestinians we can have a state independent that does respect human rights, that is democratic, that does respect diversity, and is multi-ethnic and multi-religious in a positive way. So even that experiment, I think, has failed. And yeah, so that's...
Great, thank you. Rabbi Yehuda, What, in your opinion, are the legitimate boundaries for expressing criticism of Israeli government policies, especially when on American university campuses?
I think that Israel is a nation, like many nations, that has flawed policies. And I think that problematic policies should be called out in order to be corrected. I think that there's a hesitation among many pro-Israel Jews in the diaspora to criticize the government of Israel, because I think there's this mentality that like Israel is a football team and diaspora Jews are supposed to be a fan club. And therefore, you know, nothing the team does can be wrong, and we have an obligation to defend. And of course, it's not just a football team, but a football team under attack by the whole world, and everybody wants to destroy it, and there are all these biases against it, and therefore we have an obligation to defend it no matter what. And I think many diaspora Jews look foolish defending things that shouldn't be defended. I believe that I'm not a fan. I'm a player on the team. And because I'm a player on the team, I also, not only am I a player on the team, but I have a vision for what the country should look like. And I believe in promoting policies that advance my vision, and I believe in opposing policies that stand in the way of my vision. And therefore, if I believe that there are policies or structures that are holding my people back, without even getting into what it does to the Palestinians, holding my people back from achieving the liberation that we've been aspiring towards for thousands of years, then I'm going to call out those policies and criticize them, and I would encourage diaspora Jews to do the same.
Thank you. And our last question for both of you. I'll start with you, Sami. How do you see the situation evolving, and what, in your opinion, are the necessary steps to resolve the conflict?
If I look at the current situation and I just predict how it will continue to evolve, the way I see it happening is that, and I'm going to use this word, whether people might like it or not, what we will have in 10 or 20 years is an apartheid system. We will have a system where the Israeli government control over the land, and Palestinians will have access only to their cantons that they will live in. And this will not provide security for Israel and will not provide peace, or any worse, if that illusion of the two-state solution still remains as what people are buying into and what people are promoting. We will not have two states. And I think this is the reality that we all need to accept and recognize. The settler population is, as Yehuda said, very well established and very fastly growing. The desire of the Palestinian people to say also from our end that, again, the narrative, again, whether you agree or not with it, the narrative is that we have sacrificed so much to achieve a state on a limited part of our historic land, and that was not given to us, so we need to reevaluate our whole process as well as Palestinians. So my prediction is that things are going to get worse. Voices of extremism are going to get worse. Violence is going to get worse. The Palestinian Authority might or might not be able to maintain itself over in controlling the Palestinians at a certain point. So maybe, if we talk about an intifada, which is an uprising, and historically these have been against Israel, I could easily see the next one being against the Palestinian Authority, especially if Fatah, as the main political power, collapses with the death of the person who's controlling everything now, which is Mahmoud Abbas, and it turns into different factions within that party, and all of them are arming themselves to start probably a civil war between them. So I sadly don't have an optimistic view on the way things are going now. This is why I think it is an urgent moment to look into what can be done. And I think what needs to happen, first of all, is to really put the last nail in the coffin of Oslo and say it's done. We've tried it, we've tried to push for it, we've tried to revive it. 20 years after it died, we're still trying to revive it. We need to reach a point and say, Oslo. I'm not even saying the two-state solution, I'm saying Oslo. Because for me, the Oslo process is even different than the two-state solution. Oslo was about a process of separation, of segregation between the two communities. It wasn't a peace, like I could see a two-state solution peace that actually was meant to bring people together, to build trust between people in a framework of two states. That did not even happen in Oslo. Those who engaged in peace work, joint activities, Palestinians and Israelis, were part of the elite, were part of the establishment. the children of the Fatah, or the children of the wealthy and the English-speaking were the ones who joined the children of the Israeli peace camp in coming to Vermont and doing all these other activities that we all looked at and smiled and, oh, look at these Palestinian kids and Israeli kids playing together, there is peace. You never saw children of Hamas and children of settlers coming together in a peace camp. Nobody even suggested that or promoted that, at least I don't know of, during Oslo. And so I think we need to break that stereotype that has existed, that separation and segregation is the answer. This is what Oslo was about, and we need to create a whole new understanding of how do we make it more about integration, more into trust building, more into awareness of the other's narrative. For example, as a Palestinian, as a Christian living in Bethlehem, I did not know until recently, listening to people like Yehuda and others, that 80% of Jewish historic religious sites exist in the West Bank. It's not something that was in my narrative, in my story. How can I, as a person that lives in this land, that also has religious historic claim, deny the religious historic claim of Yehuda in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank? At the same time, for me to recognize that I was also bought into a narrative that said, you as Sami only have access to 20% of your religious historic sites. As a Christian, what does that mean? Bethlehem. Well, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which is great. What did he do there? Not much. He became a refugee. He ran away, actually, within 2 years. But if I look into, as Yehuda says, my religious historic roots are in Judea and Samaria, I look into my religious historic roots as including Nazareth, as including Tiberias, as including the Galilee, as including Jerusalem. So my 80% is on the other side. His 80% is on this side. And we need to recognize this. And instead of saying this is the point of conflict, this is actually the starting point of saying this recognition by both sides is the starting point for achieving peace and justice for the communities. And I will end by saying also that I am a person who is fully committed to nonviolence. And I fully believe that we need to engage in nonviolence because acts of violence done by both sides towards each other are just, they feed into the fear, they feed into the narrative of hatred and oppression and resignation and resentment towards the other. And we have to engage together, I think, in building a movement that promotes nonviolence as a means to achieving a new vision for peace.
Thank you. And Rabbi Yehuda, last question. Same question. How do you see the situation evolving, and what, in your opinion, are the necessary steps to resolve the conflict?
Well, I see three major barriers to peace right now, and Sami touched on some of them, but I'll define them as concretely as I can. I think the three major barriers to Jewish-Palestinian peace are, number one, discussions about a two-state solution. As long as we keep talking about a two-state solution, we're preventing discussion over real solutions that could actually work. Whether the discussion is taking place on a diplomatic level, on a journalistic level, on an academic level, or even in around a dinner table. I think we need to boycott discussions over a two-state solution. If that is not happening, that can't happen, it hasn't happened, it won't happen, and in my opinion it shouldn't happen. We need to move on and start entertaining ideas that could actually work. That's number one. And number two, I think both peoples feel threatened by the story of the other. I think each of us feels that if his story is true, my story is not true. Somehow my story becomes less true if his story is true. And we're afraid to look at the conflict and look at reality, look at the last 100 years of history through the eyes and through the experience of the other. So the second thing that I think needs to happen is we need to start engaging courageously, engaging the story of the other in a way that does not make our own story feel threatened. That also requires us to deepen our own connection to our own story, to fortify it, so we're not selling out and betraying the things that are important to us. The opposite. Because I feel so deeply rooted in the story of my people and in my people's history and in my people's aspirations, I feel comfortable and safe looking at the world through the eyes of a Palestinian and looking at the conflict that way. But it doesn't threaten me, because it doesn't make my story any less legitimate. For the last 100 years, we haven't been fighting each other. We've been fighting our fantasies of the other. We've been telling true stories about ourselves, but lying about the other. We've been superimposing identities and motivations and ideologies that have nothing to do with how the other experiences himself, both ways. And it leads to very counterproductive methods of struggle. Even if you look at the way Hamas fights against Israel, they're using anti-colonial tactics. They're trying to make the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation. Because when you're fighting a colonial power and you make the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation, what ultimately happens is the occupier leaves. That's what we did to the British. That's what the Algerians did to the French. That's what the Afghans are doing to the Americans. The problem is, we are actually not what Hamas thinks we are. We don't experience ourselves as European colonizers who have a place to go back to. We experience ourselves as indigenous, as rooted in the land, as connected to the land, and as home. So if you try to use anti-colonial tactics against a people that defines itself as indigenous and endangered and has superior firepower, they're going to respond in a way that's very different from what Hamas expects. And I think Israel's doing this too with the Palestinians. We're adopting methods of struggle that are not effective because we are fighting our fantasy of the Palestinians and not who the Palestinians actually are and as they experience themselves. So the second thing I think we need to do is engage the story of the other in a way that allows us to create really a bigger story that can unite our stories. And the third barrier to peace I think we need to overcome is a combination of the Israeli ruling class wanting, and maybe some diaspora Jews, wanting Israel to be part of the West and not the Middle East, combined with many other people in the Middle East viewing Israel, insisting on viewing Israel as part of the West and not the Middle East. If we want to have peace, peace for me means Israel existing as an organic part of the region in a way that's true to our values and our identity and our story, which is something we're still unpacking now that we've come home after thousands of years. So I think that those are the three barriers that we need to overcome, and I think that if we can overcome those barriers, we can get very far. I think another problem that we just have to point out is the fact that we don't trust each other. That Palestinians and Israelis, for the most part, don't trust each other right now. We need to get to a place where we can trust each other, and I believe that because the power dynamics at this minute favor Israel, or we have bigger guns, it becomes our responsibility to make the first move towards building trust, and B, we're in the driver's seat, at least in the beginning, because the power dynamics favor us. So I think that in order to move forward, Israel does have to take some initiative, does have to take at least one unilateral step that will at least create the possibility in the minds of Palestinians, you could trust us, where things are going to change now.
Great. Thank you, Sami. Thank you, Rabbi Yehuda. Before we finish, I'd like to open it up for questions. We have time for a few questions if anyone has any. Yes.
So my question, I suppose, would be, how in your solution would you maintain a Jewish state, or is that not part of your vision?
Yes, to me or to
Both of you.
You have to make
You, I mean, I'm directing to you, but input
Okay,
as well.
that's a great question. I think we have to define Jewish state. That's the problem, we haven't done it yet. Until now, what we have in Israel is a European-style nation-state with some superficial Jewish decorations and the demographic majority. And that's what we define right now as a nation-state. And I think that that state is not Jewish enough for many Jews, and too Jewish for many non-Jews. And that's the problem we have right now. I'll use the Hatikva, the national anthem, as an example. Like, I personally have a very strong emotional connection to Hatikva. I actually think it's holy. I think it was sanctified by Jewish freedom fighters who sang it on their way to British gallows. Yet at the same time, I recognize that it's a little bit irrelevant to our chapter of Jewish history now, who have to be taken into account because they are the fastest growing population between the river and the sea. It's not Jewish enough for them. And it alienates a lot of Palestinians for whom it's still Jewish. Because it's very, it's superficially Jewish, like it's the Jewish character of Hatikva, just like the Jewish character of a state, is shallow, but exclusivist. But it's a very hard Jewish character. So I believe that we can entertain the idea of a new national anthem that's more deeply Jewish than Hatikva, so that Haredim who hear it will recognize it as something that speaks to their values. It's deeply Jewish, yet at the same time much more softly Jewish, so a non-Jew can also recognize his values there and sing it with pride and not realize necessarily that he's singing a Jewish song per se. Because there are a lot of values that we share. And I think what I said about the tikva needs to be really applied to the state as a whole, that we should take the Jewish character of our state and make it much, much deeper than it is right now. For me, a Jewish state is a state that expresses and manifests the values and ideals of my people in its policies and institutions. That's what a Jewish state means to me. I don't need to see symbols everywhere necessarily. I'm personally okay with symbols, but other people may not be. I don't need the symbols. I need to feel on a very, very deep level that this is a Jewish state. And I think we're going there. I think right now we also have to acknowledge that Zionism as a particularist Jewish nationalist movement was a very successful movement. It was maybe one of the most successful revolutionary movements in human history, because no other revolutionary movement had the challenge of gathering a broken and scattered people back to the land they were displaced from. And no other revolutionary movement had to struggle with reviving a dead language to everyday use. These are momentous accomplishments. Even our struggle against the British Empire, it's not exclusive to us, but within the context of what the Jewish people was in the 1940s and what the British Empire was in the 1940s, I would argue that our victory over England was remarkable. Yet in 1967, 50 years ago, we unified Jerusalem and Zionism ended. For 50 years, for half a century, we've been living in a post-Zionist reality, whether we like it or not. Zionism as an ideology within Israeli society has been reduced to reserve duty and a barbecue and Yom Ha'atzmaut. It's a big tent. Almost every political party in our Knesset calls itself Zionist, even though they agree on nothing. Because we all get to be Zionists now. And the more you widen the tent, the less power it has as an idea, as a value. So I believe we need to empower our youth to formulate and create the next ism of Jewish liberation, the next ideological vehicle that will bring the Jewish people forward. Right now, the conclusions I've reached, and this isn't necessarily the conclusions everybody needs to reach, but I'll share what I've reached, is that we should be focusing on maybe what I call Semitism, which is a focus on protecting the positive achievements of Zionism while correcting its flaws, correcting its mistake, cleaning up the mess it made. It means going deeper into the identity of our people and what we came back for and what are our values and what our society should be from the values of our ancestors to today, while focusing specifically on what we share in common with our neighbors. I've personally identified 3 goals that I believe to be the major goals of this generation. I think peace with the Palestinians and with the broader Middle East is a goal on par with reviving the Hebrew language and liberating our country from the British. I think freedom from the United States, not taking American money, not taking American weapons, and not taking American orders, is a goal certainly on par with liberating our country from the British. And decolonizing Jewish identity, figuring out who we are, what we've experienced in the last couple thousand years of exile and persecution and colonization, really, and fixing that. Now that we've come back to our land physically, we have to also unpack our culture, unpack our values, unpack our identity so we can create the kind of society that we really came home to create.
Can I add something to this? I just want to say, because as you're talking, I've been here for 2 weeks, and the first week I started as something called the National Prayer Breakfast. I don't know if people are affiliated with that or you've heard about it. It's where the president speaks every year.
Trump made he was there. Yeah, it's an interesting thing to say.
I was there.
Oh, you were at that?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
And for me, as I'm listening to you, I think it's a very good question, because like a country like this that claims to be a Christian nation, or a Christian country or a Muslim country, and we somehow just simply buy into that. And for me, I think it becomes a really deep question to ask, what are the values that you are bringing? What does that really mean? And I think this is what you're saying. A nation is not just defined by identity and by the labels, it's by the values that it brings, especially when you are talking about it being affiliated with a certain faith or religious or tradition or culture. And I think this is the challenge, I think, what you're trying to say, and I think is a challenge for Christians in the United States or anywhere who connect faith and governance together, to really begin to ask what are the values that we bring that are religiously based that are common values between, I think, all faiths, that are the key foundation to how we relate to each other and how we relate to the other. And I think this is a very important process to look into. And I look at what is happening here and I say, this has to be a question that is asked.
I'm glad you added that, because I'm trying to figure out how the Palestinian people can live and be okay under a Jewish state. Even I struggle, and I don't have the same challenges that Palestinians have. I struggle living here in what seems to be a soft kind of Christian state where I'm free to practice what I want, but ultimately it still feels like there's a lot of Christian values imposed upon me just by living here.
A misinterpretation of Christian values, I would say, maybe more
Probably.
than,
I want to add something to Sammy's addition, if that's okay. I want to give a practical example because I noticed that one of the problems I think my people has is that in exile, when we were in the diaspora, there were really two kinds of people. There were Jews and Gentiles. And in many situations, the Gentile was the oppressor. That was our experience for most of the centuries that we were exiled from Ireland. And I just happened to look, even in the Haftorah portion of this past Shabbat, from our prophets from the book of Judges, is the story of Dvorah. And one of the main heroes of that story is a woman named Yael. And Yael, she ends up killing the general of our enemies. And to this day, Jews are naming their daughters Yael all over the world, certainly in Israel. But Yael is not Jewish. Yael is not a Jew. Yael is a non-Jew living in a Jewish society who became a hero of our story somehow. So I think that part of the problem is this idea that there's only two kinds of people, Jews and Gentiles, and the Gentiles the enemy. That might have made sense in the diaspora, but when we have a situation of independence in our land that become broader categories of people. And I think one of the things we need to unpack as we go deeper into our identity is what is the ideal role of a non-Jew in a Jewish society. And when I say Jewish, I just want to clarify, my Jewish identity is not a religious identity. Even the kippah, even my blue and white strings are probably more socio-cultural, like scientifically speaking, they're more socio-cultural than they are religious. I believe in Torah. I believe there's a creator of the world. I believe there's an author to history. And I believe in Nevuah. I believe in prophecy. I believe in all those things, but I'm not religious. My Jewish identity is a tribal identity. It's an ethnic identity, maybe a national identity, whatever social construct you want to use. It's not. I'm not a Jew the way somebody else might be a Muslim or a Christian. I am a Jew the way somebody else might be a Kurd or an Albanian or what have you. And so when I talk about Jewish, I don't necessarily mean a religion. I mean there's this ancient civilization that developed and developed and developed, was kind of destroyed, but managed to hold on somehow, and has now come back to develop further.
Yes.
Sure, thank you. So I've been fortunate to live in Israel for a little bit, and while I was there, I joined a kickboxing gym, and there were a bunch of Palestinians that I became very, very close with. So it was great on a personal level for me to be able to engage with these people, and I developed some very strong friendships with them. Unfortunately, when you read the media, and I think the media is different in different parts of the world, whether you read the media Ma'an in Palestinian territories, or you read Jerusalem Post, or even like the BBC, these narratives are very, very different, and they're very, very polarized. So I think, especially with the government, you mentioned, I think you said only 15% of the West Bank is controlled by the PA, and it doesn't really represent the people. How do you have an agreement where the people feel like their interests are represented, and they feel like what's entitled to them is still warranted? But what I'm saying is I feel like there's such polarization in the conflict, and it's beautiful to hear when you guys speak, because you guys are speaking about coming together, not necessarily like coming apart, but how is it possible when you have like narratives in media which are kind of separating people to actually have an inclusive, I don't know if the solution is a one-state solution or a two-state solution, but especially when you have like people in politics speaking about segregation, how is there unity? What is the most legitimate means of unity in a future solution? And I hate to be pessimistic, but it's just very difficult when you read what's going on and you read different news sources. But then again, it is beautiful to see people like you coming together and trying to collaborate as opposed to fight.
Well, I mean, I'll start by saying that if you asked me 4 or 5 years ago to sit with Yehuda in any panel and share a stage with him, I would first laugh and then I would run away, just to make sure that you don't bring me here to do this. Because, yeah, I mean, the narratives that we grew up in as Palestinians is that the settlers are the worst of the enemy. And the narrative we grew up in is that get rid of the settlers and there'll be peace on earth, not just in the Holy Land. And the same on the other side. There's a narrative that says Hamas or Islamic Jihad, there's always somebody on the other side that's the worst of the worst. And if you get rid of them, if you want to be in that narrative, there will always be somebody who's the worst of the worst. And I think what we're trying to say is how do we take responsibility? And how do we get out of the mindset of blaming and complaining and victimizing all the time and just putting the blame and saying, okay, what can I do about it? And it's not easy. I mean, whatever the media says, the reality on the ground, as I said before, is that on the Palestinian side, I would say, is most Palestinians have given up on thinking anything works. This is the reality that people live in. Most Palestinians, if you ask them just to list the priorities of their daily life, what are the things that are most important to them, they'll start with the economic situation, which is very difficult. Unemployment is very high. Most Palestinians are indebted to either banks or loan sharks just to get by in their daily life. The Palestinian Authority doesn't pay the salaries on time, so they have to take more money, and the banks have also created a monopoly where they give loans to almost anybody that shows up, so the banks control Palestinian life. They look into the social struggles that we face, so economic, social, internal political struggles that we face, and then they will talk about occupation. And then this is very dangerous, I think. It's not to this, because the idea is that putting the occupation on the back burner I think if we address this issue, all other things will be addressed as well. So it's very challenging. Added to all of this is this new sort of culture that has come up, a new word in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, which is, you probably heard this word, normalization, and the anti-normalization movement, which is a movement that is saying that we have tried everything. We've tried the dialogue, we've tried the joint activities, we've tried the workshops, we've tried to sit together, we cooked hummus together, everything we have done and nothing has worked, we need to just cut. And anybody who engages with the other side is seen as normalizer, which is kind of a soft traitor. It's not attacked directly, but it's just like you're beautifying the reality, you're making it look nicer than what the reality is. And so that just add another challenge to that experience as well. For me, when people ask me where is the hope, I actually say hope exists in the rising hopelessness. And by that I mean, rising hopelessness means people are beginning to wake up to all the failed promises that we were given and all the hopes that we were given, and saying, we're done with this. The challenge for us, and this is why I say this is a very important time period for us, is to say how can we plant that seed of a new vision, of a new hope in this generation, instead of what others are probably wanting to do, is plant the seeds of more extremism and more violence and more fear in this generation. And so for me, I think this is a window of opportunity to say this young generation that really wants to look at a different solution, they need to be fully involved in coming up with a new solution. And I think the core issue is what we have been talking about, and Yehuda talks about, is building real relationships of mutual trust and respect between the communities. Very, very difficult. Very difficult to do this. But I want more Palestinians to hear Yehuda. I want more Palestinians to hear Yehuda than to hear the Israeli lefties from Tel Aviv. Because he answers their concerns and their grievances more than the left that is interested also in just the separation from the Palestinians. So it's not an easy process. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of investment, a lot of sacrifice.
Do you think it's possible? Do you think it's possible?
Well, nothing is impossible. So yes, that in a sense it is possible.
Right there.
Quick question. I just want to know, regarding this idea, are you proposing, for example, to change a tikva and change certain things, laws in Israel, and also regarding Palestinians? And also, what do you guys think of the BDS movement?
The first question is addressed to me.
I guess,
Okay. I think that Israel is a work in progress. I think what we did essentially was we defeated the British. They left. we lowered their flag, we raised our flag, and we continued the British mandate with our flag on it. Like, meaning all the structures and laws, essentially, of the British mandate, we just continued because we didn't have a real conversation over what a Jewish state looks like. We just said, okay, like the nation states, like we see over there. And I think now it's, again, still a work in progress, and part of the progress and part of the work is actually decolonizing the structures and creating it's interesting when you talk to even some of the Jews, like what they call the hilltop youth, like in the mountains around Shechem, and you talk to some of the Palestinian activists close by, let's say in Balata, you know, they're criticizing the same structures, the same westernized colonialist features of Israeli society. And I think part of the problem is, as Sami mentioned, what we call the Israeli left is really just kind of the westernized ruling class that really desperately wants Israel to be an outpost of Western civilization in the Middle East, and armed and funded by the Americans. And that's not where we're going. If you look at the demographic trajectory of Israeli society, I mean, you're talking about Jewish Israel, the most tribalist and traditionalist Israelis are growing faster than anybody else. And you asked about BDS, so I'll also say BDS is a great example of a policy, a method of struggle that is ineffective because it doesn't recognize the target of the struggle for how it experiences itself. Meaning that boycotts and sanctions work against Western societies. And as long as Israel is perceived to be a Western colonial society, BDS could work. And so maybe it works against what we call the Israeli left, the more like westernized sectors of Israeli society. And in fact it does, it weakens them. But most of Israeli society is much more tribalist, much more traditionalist, much more of a collectivist society, much more Middle Eastern in many ways. And that sector of Israeli society is actually strengthened by things like BDS. So either way, with or without the Palestinians, we're looking at a very, very different Israel in 20 years. The question is, can we include Palestinians in moving forward together, in making the changes that we need to make, and creating the type of society that we want to create? Yes?
Yeah, we could talk on BDS for hours, so I want to try to be brief. At one level, I want to start by saying that boycott, divestment, and sanctions are a nonviolent approach to dealing with systems of oppression, if it's a corporation or a country or a community. I think all of us, whether we know it or not, recognize it or not, actually engage in some sort of boycott or maybe divestment. I don't know. Sanctions is more at a country level towards others. If I, for example, find a factory that makes shoes where they use child labor, I will boycott. And the boycott is not just to simply boycott them. It's the boycott is aimed to create a movement to change the reality, to pressure groups to change the system or whatever they have been doing. So this is the starting point to say. I think the challenge with BDS, as Yehuda was saying, and as I say, is that the whole idea of the BDS campaign is still to achieve the Oslo two-state solution process. And so it has become a politically motivated process to achieve that sense of liberation for the Palestinians in the framework of Oslo and what Oslo was presenting. And so for me, as a person that actually does support BDS as a nonviolent tactic and technique, I would say a real shift has to take place within the BDS movement in not saying how do we address the occupation as the big O occupation, the political occupation, but how do we address the injustices that Palestinians face and the institutions that are imposing these human rights violations and injustices on the Palestinians, preventing the civil rights notion that I talked about from being achieved, and to work together jointly to resist these structures and systems that are preventing civil equal rights for all the people in the land. So this is where I see a shift happening in the BDS movement that doesn't exist. As a person, I have lots of criticism to the BDS movement as it stands now. I will not get into that. We're actually writing a document about that as an organization. It should be out within a month on our website. And I have criticisms of the critics of the BDS movement as well, because the BDS movement being labeled as the the process of delegitimizing a nation state like the State of Israel. I think this is completely taken out of proportion, or being labeled as an anti-Semitic movement. I think this is also taken out of proportion. This said, there's a criticism back to say, yes, there are voices within the BDS that are anti-Semitic that have to be pulled out of that movement. And these voices have to be criticized and exposed. And not to say, because you support BDS, you're with me. No. A Nazi who supports BDS has to be completely out of this movement and completely rejected just because he says that. So there are many, many complications within that movement. One of the things, for example, when we were in the political realm of engagement, which we are not now, one of the things we actually asked the BDS people to do, which they haven't done, is to simply have their website in Hebrew. The BDS website doesn't exist in Hebrew for the average Israeli to know what they're saying. Mm-hmm. And so back to the media question, what the average Israeli hears about BDS is what they hear in their media and their politicians saying, which is a rally around delegitimization and rally around the flag, and you have to stand with us because we are being delegitimized through this movement. I personally, the way things stand now, wouldn't give the movement as big of a space as it does. I don't know why the Israeli government and media do that. Honestly, the way I would compare the BDS movement now, it's like you being in a room which is dark and having a mosquito that bothers you. Honestly, I say this as a Palestinian, as a person who supports nonviolence. BDS is nothing more than a mosquito that just is annoying to you, but you keep crying about it, and this is why the world keeps hearing about it. But the reality is that you're going to live and survive with the mosquito being there as well.
I'll add that I think what offends a lot of people, a lot of Jews, about BDS is more the anti-Semitic rhetoric attached to it often on many campuses, like the denial of Jewish peoplehood. Like a lot of people who are involved in BDS work on campuses deny the very notion of our identity. They say you're not a people, you're just a religion. You're just a bunch of Lithuanians, Poles, and Moroccans who happen to share a religion and created an artificial national identity. There are very, very deep accusations attached to a lot of the BDS activity, and I think that if that anti-Jewish rhetoric wasn't attached to BDS, there would be a much more nuanced approach to BDS.
And if it says BDS helps your movement,
no, I would. By the way, first of all, I don't have a problem with boycotting like foreign corporations that benefit from our blood. Meaning, I'm okay with alternative boycotts, like Lockheed Martin or Boeing. You know, all these corporations who are selling weapons to both of us. That is where I would start, not necessarily with Sabra Hummus.
Okay.